Thank you very, very much, Tim, and also to Inez and others for joining us this evening and for helping to put this together. I'm really grateful for the opportunity. It's an early set of conversations I'm engaging in around the book that Tim has just mentioned that is due to come out, called Undoing Apartheid. The book itself, I want to introduce some of the themes because I think the question I want to pose today is why the public humanities? Why do we want to engage in something called the public humanities? I mean, there are all sorts of reasons we've advanced and advocated, but I want to make a particular set of arguments about why it is we ought to hold on to this concept of the public humanities. Now, I want to briefly introduce the book. I want to say a little bit about the institution I'm engaged in and involved in Cape Town, the Center for Humanities Research at the University of the Western Cape, partly because I think it articulates a perspective on the problem of apartheid and the post-apartheid or post-apartheid freedom. And then I want to turn a little bit from there to map out a little bit about why I think the struggle against apartheid and its consequences in the post-apartheid might help us to think about the critical importance of the public humanities as a global formation. So I want to globalize the problem of apartheid, which far too often is domesticated as a South African problem. And I want to show why it isn't a particularly South African problem. And then I'll end with a few comments about the Uncanny Valley and the project that we've engaged with over the last 10 years in a rural town just outside of Cape Town. And I suppose to help us to just pull some of that together and draw you into a conversation with me about, how we think about the potentialities of the public humanities. So Undoing Apartheid, very briefly, Tim, you want to just give me the next slide as well? And you can just move through them sequentially, the next 3 slides. Takes 3 productions that were performed in South Africa in the 1990s, just as the Berlin Wall was coming down and as apartheid was drawing to a close or coming to an end legally as an infrastructure. They plays by William Kentridge and the world famous Handspring Puppet Company. You will know Handspring Puppet Company from the Little Amal walk that has just come through Europe now, from the border of Syria all the way to Manchester. The puppet itself was built in Cape Town by Basil Jones and Adrian Kohler, who have founded Handspring Puppet Company. And there were 3 productions in 1990, in the early 1990s, that tried to address the end of the Cold War as a particular configuration for a rebirth of the subject of the human. Faustus in Africa was one of them. The next slide will be a slide of a play that is one of the plays that I think was the most profound in that series. It's Wojciech on the Highveld. Buchner was the original writer of Wojciech in the 1830s, as you know better than I do. And Kentridge did an adaptation of Wojciech by placing him in a setting in South Africa in the gold mining industries of the 1950s, in the midst of the rise of apartheid. And then the third slide, Tim, if you might give us that, is the play that was written with my colleague Jane Taylor, and it was called Ubu and the Truth Commission. And it was based on a play done by Alfred Jarry in Paris. It had 1 showing in Paris in the 1890s. And this was an adaptation by William Kentridge and Jane Taylor with the Handspring Puppet Company, called Ubu and the Truth Commission. Now, these 3 productions, for me, animate a very, very important set of questions for our contemporary world. And one of the ways they do that is they introduce, through the adaptations that William Kentridge and Handspring Puppet Company have performed, they introduce the slippery problem of race in the midst of this set of inquiries. So when you look at Faustus in Africa, it's a mainly engagement with Goethe's Faust II and the kind of conundrum of, the modern world and, the slide into mechanized forms of life, the aesthetic traditions, Natir philosophy. And Kentridge relocates Faust in Africa as Faustus and asks at the end of the 20th century how we are to receive this enigmatic figure from the 19th century who was on the cusp of a moment in history that was marked by the end of slavery on the one hand and the birth of the revolutions in thermodynamics on the other. And like our world, where we're on the cusp of another technological revolution, Kentridge draws out this moment for us and asks us to think about the present through the prism of Goethe's struggle in the 1830s as he was preparing to write Faust II. Similarly, Wojciech is the figure of the migrant worker in South Africa and the utter decimation of the subject at the hands of a technological encroachment into human existence. And so you have the Wojciech that came out of Birchner, but in the South African case is the figure that is completely diminished as a sensory subject, as a sentient subject, someone who has been so brutalized by the disciplinary society in which he is formed and the society of work and capital, that in some sense his existence is one that calls into question what it means to be a subject in modernity. And then the third play, Ugo and the Truth Commission, is really about collisions between the human and technology. And it uses a kind of Chaplin-esque form and tries to draw our attention to what happens if we are unable to resolve the increasing intensity in the relation between the human and technology, or the human and its prosthesis, and if we don't take care of those configurations in that process. So the book itself is an attempt to work through these three plays to indicate something quite substantial, which is often not recognized when we talk about a problem like apartheid in South Africa. And that is that apartheid was not suffered once, it was suffered twice. It was suffered as a form of grand apartheid, and then it was suffered as a form of petty apartheid. So there were two versions of apartheid. There was grand apartheid, which was huge structural changes. It controlled the movement, it controlled where people lived, how people lived, and so on and so forth. And then there was this more banal form of apartheid, which I call the apartheid of the everyday. And it was an uneventful apartheid. It simply was an annoyance. You couldn't go to this cinema, you couldn't go to that beach, you couldn't. But deep in that process of petty apartheid, I think was born a problem in the public sphere that we are still dealing with today. And so I want to call your attention to this underlying problem of petty apartheid that we in South Africa forgot even existed. It was so banal and so ridiculous that we even forgot that this was a feature of our lives. I mean, when we tell a generation before us that this was how we lived in the everyday, they are completely amused that, we couldn't go to this beach, or we couldn't cross this railway line, or, go to that street. And that was the mechanism of petty apartheid. And I want to show in this talk why I think petty apartheid is a bigger problem for all of us. That it wasn't simply a South African problem, that it had a longer history than apartheid. It had 200-year history. And that in fact, it was the question that Goethe, Birchner, even Alfred Jarry was struggling with in the cause of the kind of emergence of our modernity and the present in which we find ourselves. So what do I mean by petty apartheid? I want to just very crisply say that petty apartheid was an attempt to dismantle the relation between sense and perception. So let me repeat that. It was an attempt to dismantle the relation between sense and perception, what you feel and how you perceive, how you cognitively translate that. And the big experiments on this model of petty apartheid were actually conducted in Leipzig in the laboratory of one of the first experimental psychologists in the world, a man named Wilhelm Wundt. Now, Wilhelm Wundt was a fascinating figure in and of himself. He's not as well known today because experimental psychology has morphed into other forms of psychologies and forms of the discipline of psychology. But he was a very important person in bringing to bear a certain way of thinking about sense and perception in the everyday. just a footnote to this. Wilhelm Wundt's laboratory in Leipzig was where they conducted all these experiments on apperception, which means the intensity of stimuli and the translation of that stimuli into a clarified perception. And so they tried to do these like incredibly minute experiments of what they called nerve mechanics. Like how quick does it take for a stimulus to be turned into a perception? If I shock someone, how long does it take to translate that into a cognitive form, right? Now, why is this Wilhelm Wundt so important? Because the laboratory that Wilhelm Wundt built in Leipzig became a model for a laboratory in South Africa that was built in 1917 at the University of Stellenbosch under the leadership of a man called R.W. Wilcox. And Wilcox was taken in the debate on Gestaltism between Berlin and Leipzig. And so in that process, he sided with the Leipzig psychologists, with Wundt and others, and he built a laboratory in South Africa where one of the main people, the ideologues of apartheid later, a man called Hendrik Verwoerd, did his PhD. And Hendrik Verwoerd's PhD, if you were to translate it from its Afrikaans, high Afrikaans, it would be something like the blunting of emotions. Okay, so this dissertation was written in South Africa in 1917 up to 1923. I think that's more or less when he completed it. And then he went to Leipzig as a fellow, and he worked in the lab. By then, Wundt had died already. He worked in this laboratory. And these experiments gave him an understanding of how it is you could change the relationship of the human to the world by making the object a critical feature in the sensory encounter with the world. So let me give you one simple example. What Verwoerd did, for example, in the 1950s, they invented what was called the pencil test. Now, the pencil test, and your pencil is just is not a very enigmatic object, but the pencil test would be put into people's hair. And if it dropped out, that means you would be classified white, because your hair would have been of a particular form, right? If it got stuck, you most likely be classified either colored or African. So you see, the object there is a simple object. It's a trivial thing, as Bill Brown puts it. But it is a source of deep humiliation and of deep consequence for the emotions. So Verwoerd had learned in this process that if you cultivated a form of relation to the senses in the everyday, that what you would be doing is literally producing a society of control, to use Deleuze's term, a society of control through the use of everyday objects. And these could be any number of objects. They could be simple, trivial objects, but in most cases, they are objects that I would call mnemotechnic objects. And mnemotechnic objects are objects that record, that collect, and can replay, like cinemas or music musical recordings. Radios are good mnemotechnic objects. Televisions are mnemotechnic objects, or forms of objects. So that's Verwoerd's kind of attempt to hold together this apartheid of the everyday, this banal form of apartheid that everyone experienced as an annoyance, but could not avoid, because it was there in the everyday all the time. At every point, wherever you turn, it was there. Now, why am I drawing attention to this? Is because in South Africa, we've made a fundamental mistake in the transition from apartheid to the post-apartheid, is we did not take the everyday seriously. People talk about it. There are many people who have written about it. Jabulo and Ndebele has written about it. But we haven't understood what was entailed in the apartheid of the everyday. And I want to now move on to the second part of my lecture, which is to say that I, for many years, for 30 years now, have worked at what was designated as a historically Black university. Now, under apartheid, every racial group, every ethnic group was given its own university. So this university that I'm at, and Lwando Scott, who is here with us today, was designated for people of the colored race. And I'm going to use that in inverted commas because these are very controversial terms. But what had happened at that university is that we suddenly, as we lived through it, but first as students and then as academics, we learned what was happening in the everyday of apartheid. And we realized immediately that one of the things that was absent in our education was an education in the arts. So Black universities across the board were not allowed to teach the creative disciplines. And that's fascinating when you think about it, because in some sense, the subject of race was already marked in the everyday by the mechanisms of petty apartheid. And so this university has struggled for 4 decades to escape the burden of apartheid. When we go to university every day, we go and defend at least the principles of reason. I hope we do. In South Africa, when you go to these universities, you go to disavow the foundations of apartheid. And that's the difference. And so for many years, including especially in 1987, when I entered the university after a few years as a student activist and then, out of high school, what happened was that the university declared itself an intellectual home of the left. And I think there are problems with this. It's a big romantic story about the university that it tells about itself, but there were certain problems with the way in which it was configured. One of the things about that was to try and introduce into the curriculum a sense of the arts, but more importantly, the public arts. And the reason for that was that the constituencies through which the university drew its students they were drawing the students out of places that had become completely sterile to the senses. They had become devoid of any sensory kind of inhabitation other than the senses that were provoked, either to trigger actions of civil war or to put you down into a nice comfortable zone and say, you've got nothing to worry about, everything's been taken care for you. So my memory of the 1980s, as I came out of, and I spent some time as a detainee, as a political activist, arrested under the state of emergency. When I came out into the University of the Western Cape, I realized that one of the founding members of this major shift in the university to break the Apartheid Act, which is to allow students, irrespective of race, color, creed, or gender identification, to enter the university. And this was 1987, was a man called Jakes Gerwel. And Jakes Gerwel had written, he was a language specialist. In fact, his speciality was Afrikaans. And he came out of a rural area into the university as a student and then became the vice chancellor. Long story short, the place was alive with art collections. They brought in Malangatana from Mozambique. He did murals on the campus. And suddenly the campus changed something in the imagination of the student. Now, we have lost that in South Africa. And I just want to make a small point here. We have lost that because when the Truth Commission was set up, we went and we decided that what we must dismantle of apartheid was grand apartheid. But we did not look at the problem of petty apartheid. We just thought that, petty apartheid was useless. It didn't matter. But we had not reckoned with how it had infiltrated both the everyday and the arenas of consciousness and the unconscious. And so it had proliferated there in the back of people's minds for 3 decades, 2 decades, 2.5 decades after the declaration of a new democracy. It fermented there as a wound that kept repeating, as a wound that kept returning the uncanny in some form or the other. Now, what I want to say here is that there's something that is repeating in South Africa. And it's repeating in the form of this petty apartheid. And it's this form that Freud would have called the uncanny. So every time race returns as a problem, it produces a certain kind of horror. And in that process, it is producing a recollection of a past and a completely frightful perspective onto a future. And so it is in this milieu that the Center for Humanities Research decided we have to do something as humanists to undo apartheid. Not apartheid in general, but this form of apartheid that had infiltrated the everyday, that had breached the psychic apparatus, and that had caused mayhem, traumatic memories, producing Wojciech-like characters in the midst of, a despairing global economic crisis and a planetary situation, climate change, and so on and so forth. So we decided, and in the Center for Humanities Research, that we would partner with the Handspring Puppet Company, because the object was what produced apartheid's petty, condition in the everyday. The object was the main mechanism for producing this condition. And we found that when we viewed the Handspring Puppet Company's work, that when the object moved, it produced a different kind of sensory reaction. So if you look at these puppets, some of them are completely terrifying, and yet they are completely enigmatic. I mean, Handspring describes it as an emotional prosthesis, because the puppet breathes on stage. If a puppet doesn't breathe arrhythmically, for example, on stage, it's dead. It's just an object. So you have to breathe life into the object. So Tim, let's move through some slides, and I want to just pass through the enigma of So we worked with a group of young people who had worked with Basil and Adrian to develop a next generation of puppeteers in the tradition of Handspring Puppet Company, who had themselves borrowed the tradition from Mali and from Japan, the Bunraku puppetry traditions, where the puppeteer is on stage with the puppet, with the puppet. And we decided that we would work in a rural area 3 hours away to see whether we could do something that was different to what the TRC had done. In other words, rather than focus on the truth content of the transition from apartheid to the post-apartheid, we wondered whether it was possible to deliver a concept of reconciliation that was not idealistic, but that was workable. In other words, could we do something that would make reconciliation, that would give reconciliation a truth content? And we thought maybe the one way to do this is to relink sense and perception. So we took this project into Barrydale, and there was a wonderful network of young people there they were called Net for Pret. It's probably very close to the German translation, as if one makes it. It's just for fun. And this man, Peter Takela, his big worry was that young people in rural areas in South Africa grow up too quickly. Before they're 13, they're working on the farms, and then they have no horizon beyond that. So we thought that we'll bring the puppet as our contribution to what was already a process that was ongoing there. And the first few years, it was hugely difficult because we struggled to figure out, what to do. But what themes to organize the productions around, and so on and so forth. But the magical thing here is that this play happened on Reconciliation Day every year, 16th of December. And what we tried to do was to build a concept of reconciliation that would, for example, link the human to the object in a different way, link past to present in a different way. So this production was about the river and redfin. So it was a link between people living in this region and a very old, a prehistoric fish that lives in the river that was facing extinction. So to connect people. So we tried to find whether we could bring a concept of reconciliation, multiply it, and give it a truth content, move the idea of reconciliation so that it wasn't any longer an idealism. It was just about bringing Black people and white people together in some kind of ideal world. It was about how can you, in the everyday, begin tampering with apartheid structure that tried to dismantle sense and perception. And so we engaged in what we called an aesthetic education. So Tim, you can move the slides through there. This is the elephant, and I sent you the video. This was a wonderful project designed by Basil and Adrian. We built 5 giant elephants. And the magnificent thing about this is these are life-size elephants, but we recreated the exact sound of the elephant, male and female, because elephants, they communicate subsonically mostly, right? So we took 60 youth into the Addo Elephant Park, and we took a sound engineer and we recorded. We put mics in the ground all over the place. I think we lost about 20 of them anyway. Um, and we recorded sounds of elephants. And then we took that vuvuzela that we use at soccer matches here, that annoying thing, and we cut it up with a sound engineer and created male and female elephant sounds for the production. So involved a whole number of the 250 youth involved in this project from 7 years right through to university level. Let's move to the next slide. This is a beautiful puppet designed by Luyanda and Sipo Ola and Sipo Kazi. It's on a bicycle, so the entire puppet is manufactured to move through the kind of pedaling motion of the bicycle. And you can see all the young people walking through the landscape. It's a deeply rural landscape. And then just give me one more beyond that, I think. Yeah, and that's Mongiam Tombeni, who was the director of the production for a few years. Now, I want to show you these because you see the effect of this was to say that we have to do something different to undo apartheid. That apartheid could not be undone through a superstructural intervention at the level of the legal framing of apartheid. We needed to do something in the everyday. And the only way to do that was to bring the humanities and the arts into a much more proximate relation in the public sphere. Now, by this, I mean not the humanities as experts coming to indicate what is important and so on, but for the humanities to learn how to learn, and to create a space where we both encounter each other, the local community, scholars from the university, some of our international partners from Toronto and so on, where we know nothing, where we are prepared to learn and to force ourselves into a kind of futural imagination of some sort. And in some ways, the object of this, and it's the argument I make in my book, is that if we do not give reconciliation something of a truth content, we will be failing in our duty to undo apartheid in that fundamental sense that it has affected everyday life, that has infiltrated the psychic structure, that has distorted the perceptual worlds that people live in. And we would be doing generations and generations a disservice. And in doing that, we would set ourselves up for permanent war, perpetual conflict, and a generational conflict that would be hard to overcome. So I'll just pause there, and I hope that's given you. We can just move two more slides. There's just two. I'll just talk very. So that's the elephant. You can see how complicated the mechanism. The whole elephant is sewn together because it needs to be light on stage, and it's made from a cane that is molded. It took an entire year to build 5 elephants. That's how long it takes every day. 37 people, 5 years. I mean, an entire year to build 5 elephants. So it's a hugely laborious project. Behind me, you see that's the warhorse. You might have know the hamstrings work from the warhorse. There's a image on the back of my behind me sitting here, and that's Basil and Adrian's world-class. I mean, that's been seen by over 10 million people around the world now. Let's move on to the next one. This is the crowd at the Barrydale Festival. We built the amphitheater. We raised money. Basil and Adrian sold one of the horses, and then they used the money to build the amphitheater. And let's go to the next one. This is a production that we took to the schools. So we've done a production of a young girl who loses her ability to dream. And this production was very moving, Warona it's called. And at the end, there's such a traumatic story that we decided that what we'll do is we reopen the play at the end, and then we ask the students in the audience how they would like to see the story end. So we got the students to participate in scripting the end of the story and to script it in a way that wouldn't, and it's fascinating because our sense is young people are despairing, but actually young people are struggling to find ways out of this conundrum that they find themselves. So these are very young students at primary school that we did about 17,000 students saw this production in the space of a year. And then one last, And then I, in my madness, persuaded the university to take an old school and to refurbish it. And we're building a laboratory of kinetic objects where all these rural and urban youth can meet. We're building a documentary film school. There's a music school there, a jazz program. And then there's a place for visitors like Tim and others. When they visit us, they'll have offices at the top, and they'll have a view of the mountain. The rest of us will be working. But this is the Greatmore Street project, and it's an attempt to move. The historically Black university was put outside of the city because we were not meant to have any views, and we were certainly not meant to see anything, right? So what we've done is taken a dilapidated school and invested the money of an infrastructure budget and refurbished the school as a holding space for our vision of the arts as an intervention in the everyday that can undo apartheid through the problem of petty apartheid. I'll stop there.